A church covered in obscene stone creatures, a golden arm with a human bone inside, doctors diagnosing illness from a bottle of urine. To us, this looks absurd. To medieval people, it was normal. So the real question is not why the Middle Ages were strange. It is why these things made perfect sense. And the first answer is waiting on the walls of a church. Some medieval gargoyles look monstrous, some look almost comic, and some seem so openly obscene that the modern reaction is almost automatic. Why would any church choose to cover itself with imagery like this? The easy answer is that the Middle Ages were simply strange, but that answer collapses as soon as you look closely at the objects themselves, because the first thing worth knowing is that many of the carvings people casually call gargoyles are not gargoyles at all. In the strict architectural sense, a gargoyle was a waterspout, a projecting stone channel designed to throw rainwater away from the masonry so that the building would not slowly erode under constant runoff. Some of the best-known monsters in medieval architecture were, quite literally, part of the drainage system. So these carvings do not begin as random weirdness. They belong to the practical life of the building. Yet even after we separate true gargoyles from the broader crowd of grotesques, corbels, masks and beast heads, we are still left with church exteriors covered in imagery that can be ugly, exaggerated, comic, threatening, and sometimes explicitly sexual. That last part is not a modern exaggeration. It survives in stone. At Kilpeck Church in Herefordshire, whose famous Romanesque sculpture dates to the 12th century, one of the best-known carvings is what is usually called a Sheela-na-gig, an exhibitionist female figure built directly into the church's sculptural program. The British Museum also preserves a 12th century exhibitionist carving, probably from a church site in Ireland, which makes the larger point hard to dismiss. Medieval religious buildings really could display imagery that now feels startlingly out of place. So if these carvings were real and if they belonged to sacred buildings, what were they doing there? The most honest answer is that they probably did more than one thing at once, because there is no single explanation that fits every grotesque church carving across medieval Europe. Some seem to have worked as warnings about sin or moral disorder. Some may have had apotropaic force, meaning they were thought to repel evil, and some likely helped visualize the dangerous or chaotic realm that stood outside the protected interior of the church. In other cases, visual wit may have mattered as well. What the evidence does not support is the comforting modern assumption that they were meaningless decoration. We tend to expect sacred architecture to present itself as visually unified, morally clear and spiritually tidy, with the outside of a church preparing us for the calm order of the inside. Medieval churches did not always obey that instinct. Their outer surfaces could carry a whole border world of monsters, distorted faces, exposed bodies, warnings, jokes, and unsettling figures, all of which helped define sacred order by giving visible form to what threatened it. Viewed that way, the grotesque stops looking random and starts looking purposeful, even when the precise meaning of a specific carving remains uncertain. The point was not necessarily to make the church look beautiful in a modern sense. It was to make the world legible, holiness set against danger, order set against disorder, salvation set against corruption. So the real correction here is larger than terminology, though the terminology matters. Medieval church walls formed a visual language we no longer read easily, one in which the sacred could be framed by the monstrous, the comic, and even the obscene without any sense of contradiction. If the outside of a church could already be this physical, unsettling, and symbolically charged, then the next step in medieval religion becomes easier to understand, because the same culture that carved grotesques into holy walls could also place holiness inside matter itself, in an object as beautiful as it was disturbing, a golden arm built to hold a real human bone. Their gilded arm in a church treasury can easily look symbolic at first glance, perhaps an oddly literal piece of religious art, or simply a medieval taste for gold and anatomical drama. The real answer is stranger and much more revealing, because this arm was not just shaped like a human limb. It was made to hold one. One of the clearest surviving examples, now at the Met cloisters, was made around 1230 in the Meuse Valley. and its entire form was designed around the relic inside. Fragments of a saint's arm, visible through small openings in the silver that were once covered with crystal. In other words, the object was not hiding the bone, it was presenting it. Modern viewers are likely to see a human fragment enclosed in precious metal and think first of morbidity, or perhaps superstition, as though medieval Christians were fascinated by remains for their own sake. That was not the logic of the object. The reliquary existed because a saint's body was not understood as spiritually empty after death. If a saint had lived a holy life and could still intercede with God, then the saint's remains could still carry power and in some cases healing force. So the golden arm was doing something very specific. It turned an invisible claim into a visible one. The shape matched the relic because the point was not simply to store a bone safely in the church treasury, but to make the saint legible to the people who saw it. A hand blesses, touches, heals, and acts, which made the arm an especially powerful form for a reliquary, since it suggested not only that the saint had once lived, but that the saint could still do something. That idea becomes even clearer once you realize these objects were not always static display pieces. Another arm reliquary, made in Germany around 1190, and now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, shows that such objects could be carried in processions and used by clergy in ways that brought them close to the faithful. The raised hand was not only a beautiful sculptural choice. From a distance, it could read almost like a gesture of blessing. For the people who used it, there was nothing contradictory here. Bone, metal, crystal, movement, ceremony, and prayer could all work together, not as separate layers of meaning, but as parts of the same act of devotion. Churches valued relics so highly for the same reason. They were devotional objects, but they were never only devotional. A prestigious relic could attract pilgrims, bring honor to a church, strengthen local identity, and raise the status of the institution that possessed it. The golden arm belonged to a wider world of belief, ritual, competition, and public display, all centered on the conviction that sanctity could remain active in physical form. So the real correction here is not simply that medieval people were more comfortable with bones than most of us are. They did not think of relics as dead matter in the first place. The reliquary was not a beautiful container for something embarrassing or grotesque. It was a solution to a spiritual problem. How do you make holiness present in the world of sight, touch, and ritual? Seen that way, the golden arm stops looking absurd and starts looking entirely logical, built for a world in which physical substances were expected to carry meaning and reveal something beyond themselves. A similar habit of reading significance in matter did not stop at religion. It shaped medicine too, where another ordinary substance, far less glamorous than gold, could be treated as a serious source of knowledge. A flask of urine in a doctor's hand. If you saw a medieval doctor holding up a flask of urine to the light, you would probably assume you were looking at a joke, or at least at one of those historical scenes that only survives because medicine used to be far more primitive than anyone realized. But in the medieval world, this was not comic background detail. By the 14th century, the clear urine flask, or matula, had become one of the most recognizable symbols of a physician. Symbols usually attach themselves to what a profession considers essential, and medieval medicine treated uroscopy, the inspection of urine, as a serious way of discovering what was happening inside the body. The object itself already tells part of that story. A matula was not just any container. Its clear glass and rounded lower shape were suited to observation because physicians wanted to study color, clarity, bubbles, and sediment, all of which they believed could reveal the condition of the patient. Urine, in other words, was not treated as waste first. It was treated as evidence. That logic made sense inside humoral medicine, which taught that health depended on the balance of the body's internal qualities and fluids, and that disturbance inside the body could reveal itself through outward signs. If the inner condition could not be seen directly, then a visible sample mattered. The doctor was trying to read what the body had written into the flask. It is easy to laugh and imagine physicians making wild guesses from pee, but medieval uroscopy was not supposed to be casual intuition. It aimed at method. That becomes much clearer once the urine wheel enters the picture. The diagnostic tradition associated with Gilles de Courbet and later represented in works such as Ulrich Pinder's 1506 printed charts, tried to classify urine by color and condition so that what the physician saw could be compared against an established scheme. The framework behind it was wrong by modern standards, but the effort itself was not random. It was an attempt to turn the hidden body into something visible, classifiable, and legible. That is also why a patient did not always need to appear in person. In some cases, a sample could be carried to the doctor by a messenger, which means the macula allowed the body's condition to travel without the body itself. That detail makes the practice feel both stranger and more coherent, because it shows just how much diagnostic weight could be placed on a single fluid once it had been absorbed into a trusted medical system. It also helps explain why the urine flask became such a powerful medical emblem. A doctor who could inspect the sample, compare its visible qualities, and pronounce on the patient's condition was demonstrating trained judgment in public. The flask was small, but it stood for a whole claim about expertise. None of this means medieval uroscopy should be rescued as secretly modern. It was limited by the theory that shaped it, and over time it became vulnerable to abuse, especially when practitioners claimed they could diagnose and prescribe too much from the sample alone. That is part of why urine reading later became an easy target for mockery. But the ridicule came later. The original practice deserves to be understood first on its own terms. So the real correction here is not that medieval doctors were right about urine. They were not. It is that they were trying to do something far more serious than the stereotype allows. They believed the hidden condition of the body could be read through visible signs, and the macula gave them a portable, standardized, and apparently intelligible piece of the patient to examine. Once you see that, the urine flask stops looking like a punchline and starts looking like what it really was. One of the central tools of a medical culture that believed knowledge came from reading the world carefully, comparing what was seen, and fitting it into an inherited system of interpretation. And that same respect for preserved, organized knowledge leads naturally to the next object, because few things reveal the value of knowledge more clearly than a book so precious that it had to be chained in place. Walk into a chained library for the first time, and the immediate impression is almost impossible to avoid. The books look like prisoners. They are fixed in place with iron, shelved in a way that feels wrong to modern eyes, and surrounded by exactly the sort of visual language that makes us think of restriction, control, and people being kept away from knowledge. That is why the familiar explanation comes so easily. The books were chained because authorities did not want people reading them, but the object itself tells a different story. In a chained library, the point was usually not to make a book unreadable. It was to make sure the book stayed there. Hereford Cathedral, which preserves the largest surviving chained library, still shows how the system worked. One end of the chain was attached to the book, the other to a rod on the shelf, and the volume could be taken down and consulted at the desk without being carried away. The chain did not say, "Do not read." It said, "Read here." A manuscript was not a disposable object, but the product of costly materials, skilled labor, and time that could not be replaced casually. Copying a book might take months, and losing one could mean far more than the loss of a physical item. It could mean the disappearance of something difficult, expensive, or even impossible to reconstruct quickly. Another odd feature of chained libraries begins to make sense at that point. The books were often shelved with their foredges facing outward rather than their spines, which can look backwards until you realize the arrangement served the chain. It allowed the book to be lifted down and opened without twisting or tangling the metal attached to it. Even the shelving was shaped by use. The image seems to promise censorship, yet the mechanism points to a practical compromise between access and protection. A chained book was not locked in a box or sealed in a chest. It was still meant to be handled, consulted, and read on site, and in many cases the security system was what made that consultation possible. That does not mean medieval libraries were open to everyone in a modern sense, and it would be misleading to pretend otherwise. Access still depended on institution, status, and circumstance. But chaining did not automatically mean knowledge was being hidden from all readers. Often it meant the opposite. The book was valuable enough to protect precisely because it was meant to remain available. In the medieval world, learning did not float freely in some abstract realm of ideas. It lived in objects made of parchment, ink, wood, leather, and metal. It occupied shelves, required labor, could be stolen, and could disappear. By the 12th century and after, chaining had become one practical answer to that problem, and surviving collections such as Hereford make the logic visible in a way that no abstract explanation ever could. The chain looks harsh only if we begin with the wrong assumption. Once we start with the value of the book itself, the system becomes far easier to understand. So the real correction here is not merely that books were expensive, though they were. It is that the chain belonged to a world in which knowledge was scarce, vulnerable, and materially precious enough to require its own architecture of trust and restraint. Yet that same world, which could be so careful about preserving learning, was never only solemn or severe, because inside church furniture itself, we find another kind of medieval object altogether. Carvings so playful and ridiculous that they seem almost impossible to place in a sacred setting. Lift the seat of a medieval choir stall and find a fox dressed as a priest, or rabbits turning on a hunter, or some other grotesque little scene that looks as though it belongs in a fable rather than a church. And the first reaction is usually the same. What is this doing here? The question becomes even stranger once you realize that the carving is not part of some distant wall decoration easily ignored by the clergy. It is built into the furniture itself, hidden beneath a folding seat used during worship. That practical detail matters because what you are looking at is a misericord, literally a mercy support. During long services, the seat could be tipped up, leaving a small ledge underneath so that a cleric could rest while technically remaining standing. In other words, the strange carving was attached to an object of discipline, routine, and physical endurance at the heart of church life. Yet the images placed there could be comic, grotesque, imaginative, and sometimes openly obscene. The easiest explanation is that these were just random, irreverent doodles, small private jokes hidden where no one would care too much. But the surviving carvings suggest something more interesting, because although misericords can certainly be funny, they often draw on a shared world of proverbs, beasts, satire, moral warning, and playful inversion that medieval viewers would have recognized. One of the clearest examples comes from the 15th century misericords of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where a fox in priest's clothing preaches to a flock of geese. The image is funny on its face, but it was not just funny. It drew on the proverb, "When the fox preaches, look to your geese," on the wider stories of Reynard the Fox, and on the fear that smooth words might conceal deception. In that sense, the carving could make people smile and warn them at the same time. That combination helps explain misericords more broadly. The Met's 15th century French choir stalls make clear that these carvings commonly include grotesque, imaginative, and even obscene figures, but the meaning was not uniform. Some may have reflected the perils of the world, some may have commented on scripture or theology, and some clearly delighted in medieval humor and fantasy for their own sake. There was no single formula that explains every misericord in every church. Some carvings probably entertained more than they taught. Some may have functioned as warnings. Some may have been valued simply for their inventiveness. But all of them belonged to a sacred environment that did not insist on looking emotionally uniform at every point. Medieval churches could hold discipline and wit, devotion and absurdity, moral seriousness and visual play all at once. The same culture that produced sermons, bestiaries, exemplar and marginal images could also place strange little dramas beneath the seats of the clergy without feeling that religion had somehow been betrayed. Seen that way, the misericord stops looking like accidental irreverence and starts looking like evidence that the sacred world of the Middle Ages had more range than ours often does. Humor was not necessarily outside devotion. Sometimes it lived quietly underneath it. When devotion and humor can coexist inside the church itself, the next object becomes much easier to understand, because medieval piety also made room for display, identity, commerce, and even a little irreverence in public. That is exactly the world of the pilgrim badge. Taken on its own, this object might not seem like much. It is small, cheap, made of lead or tin-lead alloy, and easy to mistake for the sort of minor trinket that survives only because medieval people, like everyone else, enjoyed collecting things. That first impression misses what made the pilgrim badge so useful, because this tiny object could hold an extraordinary amount of meaning at once. One of the best examples survives in the Met, a badge made at Canterbury between 1350 and 1400 that shows the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in miniature. At the most basic level, it worked as proof. If you wore that badge, you were showing that you had reached one of the most famous pilgrimage destinations in Western Christendom, and that mattered in a world where travel was slow, difficult, and often spiritually charged. The badge was also meant to be seen. British museum examples still preserve loops, pins, or clasps that show how such objects could be sewn or fastened to clothing, which means the pilgrimage did not end when the traveler returned home. It remained visible on the body, where it could announce where the wearer had been, which saint or shrine they were attached to, and what kind of devotion they wished other people to recognize. That already makes the badge more than a souvenir in the modern sense. Pilgrimage objects could help their owners remember an encounter with a holy place, and some were believed to retain something of the shrine's virtue or miraculous force. The badge could be treated as a small portable extension of the sacred place itself. That is why the object becomes so interesting once you stop thinking of it as a cheap keepsake and start seeing it as condensed pilgrimage. Journey, shrine, saint, memory, status, and devotion had all been compressed into something ordinary enough to pin onto a cloak. The badge did not exist outside economics any more than it existed outside belief. Shrines sold badges and other souvenirs, and the movement of pilgrims brought money into the towns and institutions that housed important relics. Commerce did not cancel devotion here, it traveled alongside it. A pilgrim could buy a badge because it commemorated a holy journey, showed others where they had been, and preserved contact with the saint. Late medieval Europe also produced many kinds of wearable badges, not all of them strictly devotional. The wider badge world could include political, secular, satirical, or amuletic meanings as well, which only strengthens the main point. Medieval people were very comfortable turning belief, allegiance, memory, and identity into things that could be worn in public. So the real correction here is not just that pilgrim badges were deeper than souvenirs, though they were. It is that in the medieval world a souvenir could already be proof of travel, sign of devotion, object of memory, public statement, and perhaps even a small carrier of sacred power. Seen in those terms, the badge stops looking trivial and starts looking like one of the clearest expressions of how medieval religion moved through ordinary life, attaching itself to metal, clothing, money, movement, and social display, without any sense that the sacred had been diminished by becoming public. By now, the pattern should feel unmistakable. Medieval objects were rarely only one thing. They could be devotional and practical, serious and social all at once. That layered way of seeing the world reaches its most intense form in the next object, where remembrance itself is built out of human remains. The walls are built out of skulls. The chandelier is made of bones. The dead have been arranged into patterns that were clearly meant to be looked at. The reaction is almost automatic. This feels less like a church than a nightmare. That reaction is understandable, but it can also be misleading because the first thing to say about an ossuary is that it did not begin as decoration. It began as a problem. At Sedlec, near Kutna Hora, the remains of about 40,000 people eventually came to be gathered into the chapel after centuries of burial, especially in the aftermath of plague and war. The site had become a desirable place to be buried because of its association with holy soil brought from Jerusalem, which meant the cemetery drew the dead long before the bone arrangements that visitors now remember most vividly. This began with pressure, not symbolism. An ossuary appears when there are too many bodies, too little burial space, and a religious obligation to treat the remains of the dead with care. The bones were not simply discarded once burial ground ran out. They remained part of a sacred human community that still demanded reverence. That is also why the most famous image of Sedlec needs one important correction. The chapel's present decorative arrangement is not entirely medieval in the form visitors know today. Much of the arrangement that makes the site so visually unforgettable was shaped later, especially in the deep 19th century. But that does not weaken the deeper point, because the need for an ossuary was real. The remains were real, and the decision to keep them within sacred space still reflects a world very different from our own. Medieval Christianity did not treat death as something that had to vanish from view before life could continue. The dead were prayed for, buried near saints and altars when possible, remembered liturgically, and held within the spiritual life of the community. In that setting, bones inside a chapel were not automatically a violation of holiness. They could serve as reminders of mortality, humility, and the fate shared by everyone who entered the building still alive. That is what makes the ossuary more serious than a macabre curiosity. The bones are not there simply to shock. They are there because the dead remained spiritually present, and because medieval people were more willing than we are to let physical remains speak openly about what awaits every living body. Seen that way, the chapel stops looking like evidence of some dark medieval taste for horror and starts looking like an unusually visible form of remembrance. The living did not stand apart from the dead as sharply as we tend to do now. They worshipped near them, prayed for them, buried their relatives among them, and accepted that sacred space could contain not only relics of saints, but the ordinary bones of the faithful as well. Modern societies hide death behind hospital curtains, sealed cemeteries, and private grief, as though daily life can remain cleaner if mortality stays out of sight. Medieval Christianity often did the opposite. It kept death physically close because it was spiritually important. That is why a chapel made of bones could make sense. What makes these objects so memorable is not simply that they are strange. It is that each one preserves habits of thought that once felt perfectly ordinary. A grotesque on a church wall, a saint's arm in gold, a doctor's flask of urine, a chained manuscript, a comic carving beneath a choir seat, a pilgrim badge pinned to clothing, a chapel filled with bones. None of these objects was made to puzzle us. They were made for a world that knew exactly what to do with them. And that is probably the real distance between their world and ours. Not an absence of logic, but a different arrangement of life, death, belief, humor, and material things than the one most of us live inside now. If one of these objects changed the way you see the medieval world, let that feeling stay with you. Like the video. Subscribe if you haven't. The bones, badges, books, and carvings survived. The people who once touched them mostly did not. But their world is still waiting to be understood here on Riddle Me This Mysteries.